Who are you when half of your DNA isn't what you thought it was? This is the question that is believed over 200 people had on their mind going into their late teens over the last decade in the Netherlands. Behind it all was one man who abused his patients' trust. Today we'll explore why Jan Karbaat allegedly inseminated his patients with his own sperm and discuss what still needs to be done to tackle fertility fraud. Detective Squad, it is 6 p.m. on the dot. You know what that means. It means that I have not recorded when I was supposed to over the weekend because my whole laptop glitched and the whole last script got deleted, and then I was left with a draft that I made like 5 days before that. So that was great. That was great, but here we are. Now it has been completely restructured. Whatever that that glitch that was deleted, whatever that was, is no more. You have the version 2.0 of the script, rather like 5.0. It's cool, it's cool, I'm not complaining. I'm so happy to be here because the topic of the day is fertility fraud and it's insane. And I have a personal connection with it. I'll leave that towards the end. I don't mean I have a personal connection with the story of the day. I don't know anybody that I'm talking about. That's not what I mean. I mean, I have a personal connection with egg donation, as in I'm looking to become a donor. Possibly, possibly not. Again, I'll leave it to the end because not everybody likes to listen to me rant about it. This story I have heard of during quarantine, during lockdown. Remember that beautiful part? When the Immaculate Deception, the podcast, came out. So usually when it comes to the podcasts, I have my own, you know, shameless plug. So I prefer the ones that cover different case per episode. However, there are a few ones, you know, Sweet Bobby that I mentioned a few videos ago, then the Immaculate Deception. There are a few ones that, you know, I enjoy where the whole podcast is just like 6-7 episodes on one particular case. And this one drove me insane. Like, it's still now, when researching it, because of me looking into egg donation, it still just blows my mind on so many levels because it's so layered. It's not even twofold, it's just layered on so many levels. You can take it from all of these different angles and people don't speak about it. And not people like you and me, like lawmakers, people, you know, creating laws, creating repercussions, consequences for these people. They are the ones that aren't changing much, really, except in Indiana. Indiana is great. You will learn to love Indiana during this podcast. So, we have not had this in a while. Yeah, if you have been here for a while, say it with me. Say the dumb intro with me. We have not had a Gone Bad episode in so long. Maya is the name. Gone Bad is the game. What is the squealing thing on the street? What is Gone Bad, you may ask? It is the series that I do on this channel where I sit on my fat ass and I tell you a story about a person that, like you and me, had lived a normal life, but then, boom, one day they just switched to crime. And they scare me, you know? I mean, serial killers and people who have maybe stronger motives to just turn to crime eventually scare me, don't get me wrong, petrify the living shit out of me. But I feel like there is a whole like sub-genre that other people don't really explore much, and that is when people just snap. And the special case that we are talking about today, apparently, according to sources, decided to turn to crime in his old age of 60 plus. I do apologize if you are 60 plus watching this video. Now, playing that in my head, that sounds like I'm calling you old. He is an old piece of shit. You'll see what it looks like. He's disgusting. Like, listen, you know, your grandparents? Cool. You, in your 60s? Cool. You're not getting yourself out of this one. You're not getting yourself out of this one. Everybody, if you had anybody in the audience over the age of 60, they're out. Cool. Let us dive into the topic of the day. And our story today starts in 1992, the year when your homegirl here was born, but another woman across the pond, well, across this pond really, in the Netherlands was struggling to conceive herself. And that actually reminds me that I have put this into the script but haven't voiced it, haven't uttered it. If you are sensitive towards the topic where people are unable to conceive after trying for however long, please see this one out. Like, if this is something that is going to trigger you, I usually go in depth when it comes to the topics. You can see even just from the lengths of the videos. I would just suggest watch another one on my channel. You know, I would like you to stick around so badly. But again, if this is something that you will find triggering, see this one out. Click the hell out of this one. I should have said that on top of the video. I know, I just got reminded when I actually said the intro line and I was like, okay, this needs to be actually uttered, so people, you know, don't just go in and then by the end of it they hate my guts because I didn't warn them. So our story starts with a woman called Esther, who, when she was 35 years old, made two decisions. First things first, Esther actually just came out of a 12-year-long relationship in 1992, and she was just recently single. So she decided, you know what, I have been waiting for a long time, you know, I thought this guy was the one, and I really want children. So the second decision that she decided after deciding to become a mother was to opt in for IVF in order to get donor sperm, to inseminate herself, and that would result in her having one child, possibly then even later down the line, depending on how successful this was, maybe even a second one. The situation that Esther found herself in at that point was to check for costs. Now, I couldn't find anywhere online in 1992 in the Netherlands what the cost would have been. If somebody knows, if somebody who has any sort of touch points with this story or just knows for whatever reason, please let me know. I would actually really like to know the cost of this through the ages, because what I can tell you now by looking into the costs of whether it is egg donations or whether it is actually sperm donations for the parents, for the prospective parents, this is one of the money hungriest industries. That is not the right term, but you know what I'm trying to say, because these prices are just actual extortion. It's like daylight robbery. And that's what pisses me off so much. It's the parents that are trying so desperately to conceive that are going to get overcharged, depending on a couple of factors here. So right now, from what I have found in the UK, starting off point is about £900. But that, of course, depends on whether you want your sperm tested, stored, transported. All of these different factors come into play. Also, the cost depends on the fertility clinic, the type of treatment, the number of cycles you will need. So if it's unsuccessful upon the first try, then you have to pay up for the second one. If you are using your partner's sperm or if you're using donor sperm, then if you opt in for the ID of the donor to be released versus the ID of the donor not to be released. So the ID release donor option is higher than the non-ID release. The costs also vary depending on the country where you're treated in, depending on what kind of genetic matching you want. So let's say you want your child, I don't know, to have blue eyes and to have blonde hair. Well, that will cost more money, purely just because somebody then, I don't know, has to sift through some admin work and the paperwork of the potential donors and then match you up with the right person. And the money we're talking about is like, you know, a couple of hundreds of pounds here that are just added to the cost. So as I mentioned, the baseline here, and from what I've seen in the US, is usually around like £1,000, dollars, and then depending on all of these factors, they just said, you know, a couple of hundreds here, a couple of hundreds there. So in the end, the average, I would say, from what I've seen, that the parents are paying is not less than $1,500 or pounds. And that's just literally baseline. Just you trying to match yourself with somebody that maybe, you know, somebody else won't ask you about when they see you, whether or not that is your child. It's literally so infuriating. And we are just like 5 minutes into this case. Regardless of what the prices were in 1992, In this case, actually, it would be said that a lot of treatments Jan Karbaat did were actually free of charge or relatively cheap. So he would be charging the lowest possible fee for the parents. And that's not all. The first test tube baby was, artificially inseminated into a woman in 1978. So in 1992, this was still relatively new as science, relatively new as a process, meaning it was unregulated, which is what we're going to talk about, but also meaning that, they didn't have to charge extortionate prices. And the way that Esther and so many other people in this story would actually come to learn about Jan would be via recommendation. This guy had a clinic, his own clinic, with a stork on top of it, and I think it was like above or below his house. I think, pretty sure from what I've listened to, that he also lived at the exact same location. And in the 90s, Jan would have been in his 60s. So the guy obviously had, some sort of experience even before that, and then in this industry he would also be considered a pioneer.
Mogelijk, maar wij deden het voor de laagst mogelijke prijs. He told me that a lot of treatment was just free of charge. I was like, really? I saw the receipts of people paying for that for months and years. I just realized, this guy wouldn't tell me anything more. He's just a liar.
So people in the industry recommended Jan Karbaat to Esther as the best doctor in business. She would say that he seemed very good at what he did, he was a pioneer in his attitudes, he talked her through what it would be like to raise their children on her own, how maybe they will ask questions, what kind of questions they might ask, basically all of the possible situations, and he seemed to Esther to be serious and professional. He was reassuring. He made sure that Esther knows that when the kids are of age, I think at that point it will be 16, right now in the UK at least it's 18. Again, the age when the child can actually inquire about a donor depends on the country as well. That is exactly how unregulated it was. But he ensured Esther to know that, if the kids ever want to learn about their dad, when they're of the right age, they actually can. And Esther said in this article that I read, he was a doctor. He's a doctor. He's the person of respect in a white coat that has his own clinic, that has the right people in there, that seems to know what he's talking about. So I trusted him, which is something that happens in so many cases, especially of doctor death cases, when there is a person of trust, the person with degree, the person with accreditations, that you were recommended to go and then get yourself checked, get the right treatment, and you just think, well, why wouldn't I trust them? I'm going to put the trust into this educated person. And it happens to so many of us. If you were to go across the road to your medical center right now about any sort of diagnosis, you would believe what a doctor told you because of their qualifications.
Also doctors, and all of them recommended Karbaat because he was well known as the best doctor. Het is dus een soort een uitdaging en je probeert zo snel mogelijk een vrouw haar wens te voldoen, dat ze dan dus die zo gewenste baby krijgt.
This was further confirmed for Esther when she actually talked to Jan Karbaat about what kind of traits she wants when it comes to her child. He again assured her, once he saw all of the pictures of the relatives, all the pictures of the family members, that he can find a good match, that this is something that he is an expert in. He said he would make sure the donor was a man who would also be open to be traced later, because this is something that is also important. The donors have to choose, even back then when everything was offline, still, or just in the early days of it being online, they would have to fill out these donor passports. Now everything is digital. Back then everything would have just been paper, and they have to agree whether they want to be the ID release or non-ID release donor. So they have to agree on their end, and that's how they're then matched up with the parents based off of the parents' preferences.
In 70s and 80s, it was completely legal not to tell anyone about who the donor is. Technically, even if the donor was the doctor himself.
What Karbaat couldn't guarantee to Esther or any of his patients really for that matter is how many attempts it would take. So for Esther it took actually 9 unsuccessful attempts before she would have a daughter born in 1994, and then in 1995 she would give birth to her son. Karbaat, in the meantime, would assure her that both of those kids are from the same donor, so that they have the same father. It would be more than 2 decades until she will learn that yes, that was correct information, but that the father wasn't just any donor. So being a single mom, obviously this was tough. Raising 2 kids now after so many unsuccessful attempts, after trying so hard, but this is what Esther wanted, so she didn't complain. The family kind of moved around. I suppose from what I've read that this was within Netherlands, but then the children were thriving, and it seemed like Karbaat actually fulfilled the part of the deal where the children were to look alike one another and also to fulfill some genetic matching points that Esther had also wanted. Esther, like so many other parents that find themselves in this situation, also was quite open with her kids. She would tell them, a man gave his seed, and that's how you were born. If you want to know who he is, you will get a chance to find out one day. So the kids are growing up fine, and something that you will realize in this story is that, as they're growing up, sometimes they're bullied, or, kids ask them, why don't you look like your parents? Especially if the father is in the picture. But even for Esther, it would be, like, where is the dad? And then she would just lie to them, like, oh yeah, he just left and moved. So she just took the occupation of single mother seriously. But the kids kind of start asking questions, and their friends start asking questions. And soon those questions become worries about, in particular, the negative personality traits that they notice that they have, and they also notice don't match up anybody else in the family. Like, my mom isn't anything like this. My mom isn't selfish, egoistic, a narcissist. So where is this coming from? It must be coming from this father that gave me the seed that I have never met.
Alles wat ik niet van mezelf begreep, of waarom ik bepaalde dingen deed, of waarom ik zo actiegericht op mijn doel af, die werkmentaliteit, die discipline.
All of the people interviewed, they're a couple of people that are sort of like poster children in a way for this case, like Joey, Inge, Marsha. All of them say that they started questioning, again, as they're growing up, early teenage years, why are they manipulative, for example? Is this why they're control freaks? Because they don't know half of their genes, they don't know their dad's genes, they don't know what his family is like. Any negative traits that they couldn't really connect to anybody, any member of the family on their maternal side, they suddenly start worrying about them.
Do you worry about, because there is something going on in that head,
yeah.
Do you worry or even think about the characteristics he had and whether or not you have any of those characteristics?
Yes, of course. We question it all the time. Do we have the same manipulative things, or do we see the things that the way he did at the time? But also he was a child of his era. Mm-hmm. Back in the 70s, he was really convinced that every woman who could possibly have a child has the right to have a child.
And then usually by the age of 16, which would be the case in Esther's family, whoever is the older child, or if they only have one kid, that kid starts kind of inquiring about the dad. They know that they're of the age now where they can actually find out about the identity of the donor. So in Esther's family, when her daughter turned 16, she didn't really care about connecting with her dad. However, when her son did, he did want to know who his dad was. Esther would say for a boy to grow up without a father figure is a big thing. A father is important, especially for a boy. I wanted to know who he was, there were things I wanted to ask him, and I wanted to find out whether certain ways I behaved were connected with him. Things that made me seem different from my mother and my sister, like that I am much more laid back than they are. So whether it is, the innocent personality traits, like in Esther's family case, where her son just thought, I'm laid back and these two seem to be control freaks, or whether it is more sinister. In more cases, it is about narcissism, it is about being manipulative, it is like really negative traits that I can't connect to anybody. Usually it is the combination of these two things, them starting to think about personality traits and also them being of age where they can actually find out who the donor was, that lead them to start looking, to go back to their parents and have a lot of times an awkward conversations, because obviously the mom, especially if these were single moms, they sometimes would feel like, well, I feel like I wasn't enough, because why are you suddenly inquiring about your dad all of these years after? But eventually they would have that conversation with their mom, and then the moms in these instances would go to the clinic. They would be like, well, I know where I was conceived, the clinic is still there, the doctor is still alive, it should be easy. I should just go in and get these donor details, because that is the option I have opted in for, because they should have what they called at the time donor passports, where all of the information about the donor would be logged. Today, it is a bit more regulated from what I have looked into for my personal investigation, let's say. And here in the UK, once you're of the age of 18, if you are parent or the actual child, then you would only be provided certain information. I think it's full name, I don't even know if it's contact details, I think it's like last place of address. I'll figure it out and put it as a screenshot on the screen once I find out the FAQs where I have read it from. But back in the day, this was paperwork. This was like archives of just actual paper and forms that have been filled out, whether it was in 70s, 80s, or 90s, like in Esther's case. So Esther approached the organizations that then were to get in touch with the clinic and get her the information that she wanted. And this seemed simple to begin with. But then the news that came back to her from these organizations were that everything was in disarray. The records were said that they were going to be sent to them, but then they weren't. They haven't been properly kept. And it was going to be a mission to find out who the father was. So what originally seemed like it's going to be just an email exchange and they will find out the details, suddenly turned into phone calls, into filling in forms, and just further requesting information. So before we dive into what happens when they finally track Karbaat down, let us actually try to break down the issue that we have on hand, and that is fertility fraud. So fertility fraud, by definition, is a failure on the part of the fertility doctor to get consent from the patient before they inseminate them with the doctor's own sperm. The first in vitro fertilization, IVF baby, was born in 1978. But decades after, this is still extremely poorly regulated industry that is, on top of that, very money hungry. And if you think it's unregulated when it comes to public records, for example, here, let's say you want to go through NHS instead of a private clinic, well, then on top of that, then you have private clinics and private healthcare that have different set of rules, different set of FAQs, different regulations to the public ones. If I were to summarize everything that I have heard from the podcast, from the documentaries that I have watched, the main issue with fertility fraud and why it's so poorly unregulated is that the guidelines just aren't international. So you could have completely different set of guidelines here compared to the US, and then in the US compared to Canada, and in the US compared from state to state in itself. So starting from something super basic like the cap. the cap of the children that the donor can actually have. So, for example, in the UK right now, the cap is 10 families of unlimited children, because again, you can't really expect to know, once you donate your eggs or your sperm, if the woman in question is going to have one child, is going to have triplets, quadruplets, how many children she's going to have. Now, in the Netherlands, Dutch law prohibits donating anonymously, and that was changed actually in 2004. And the clinics limit donors to 25 children. And the law also prevents them from donating at more than one clinic in the country. So that is one other point that is just so ambiguous on so many levels, because, for example, in the US, there are no legal limits. As in, not legal limits on the amount of children that you have, or like families that you were to have. The only guidelines from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine is to have 25 children per donor in a population of 800,000. So this is in US and Canada, which means, of course, I got myself into doing math, because I was like, wait a minute. Wait a fucking minute. There are cities in the US that have millions of people. What are we even on about? So, let's say you live in New York, right? Because that was easy math for me, because it's 8 million, give or take, more like give, it's more than 8 million. But let's just say New York has exactly 8 million people on the dot. Did you just in this reality kill off like hundreds of thousands of people? I didn't. This is fictional. Give me a break. Who is giving you a break? Nobody's arguing with you. Okay, so 8 million. So if you're doing math logically in your head, this is the easy math, that's why I chose it. That means that you could have 250 children. And on top of that, because that isn't enough, in the US, what they struggle regulating, again from everything I've seen online, and doesn't really surprise me, considering that during quarantine I learned that you can get guns in Walmart, and that in certain Walmarts, for example, you just need to fill out a form, tick a box like you're mentally stable, just like, yep, tick, that's great, and they will just hand you over a weapon, which is so fucking scary. Well, pretty much when it comes to fertility clinics, it's a similar kind of process. So for example, if you were to go to the clinic in New York, just like down the road, and tell them, you know what, no, I have never donated anything, while you have like 250 children out there living somewhere, if, they don't check anything, which in most cases they wouldn't, you just tick the box on the form, and you can again start whole different array of families, just fathering all these different sets of children. And again, they won't find out until they're of age, until they are either 18, 16, depending on the state, depending on the country, depending on anything, depending on the laws there. And why? What is in there for the donors? Well, you guessed it, a lot of money. Because as much as this kind of industry extorts the parents and the families, the donors, again, depending on different regulations in different cities and in different countries, earn a substantial amount of money. So in the US, while we are still there, just being freaked out by everything, the compensation also varies from state to state, but a donor that, for example, is to give 2 specimens a week might actually make $1,500 a month. Just a PSA, because I don't want people in the comments to be like, wow, Maya is encouraging never working again and just going from clinic and donating sperm. No, seek therapy. But you can also see how, if you are just money hungry, if this is your only motive in order to donate your eggs or sperm, you could live off of it, which is so insane to me, that this is not even further exploited. We don't hear about these cases like every single day, based off of how few regulations there are. The co-founder of the Donor Sibling Registry says that there is nothing in the US or anywhere that would keep a donor from donating at more than one sperm bank. If you were to show up at one and claim that you haven't donated anywhere else, Nobody would really know. As in, they would ask you, sometimes again it would be a form that you would fill out, but they wouldn't really do the work in order to find out. And few, if any, laws govern the private side of the business, the private donations, the private sperm banks. And what further facilitates this is the lack of alignment in regulations when it comes to even ID and non-ID release donors. And that is twofold, really. Because, for example, if I were to donate my eggs, I have to agree, basically tick the box in terms of saying that I will not seek contact with any of the children born from my donations. So I can't do anything from my end, even when they're 16, 18, however many years old. And on the other end of that, it depends what option you choose. So if you choose to be an ID release donor, your child then is going to have the opportunity, if they want, when they're usually of the age of 18 nowadays, to actually find out about you, to contact you, to find out where you last lived, to be able to get in touch, speak with you for whatever reason they want. Maybe they just want to know about their maternal or paternal side of the family and explain the personality traits, like in so many of these cases. These layers on their own actually facilitate somebody not being able to uncover something like fertility fraud, possibly for a good number of decades. And even when they do, we'll speak about what problems they face. But let's say you choose to be the non-ID release donor. The clinic, the sperm bank, whatever they're called in question, whatever sort of agency you're using in order to donate, cannot reveal your details. But now we have the Ancestry, we have 23andMe, we have all of these, private companies, different even startups, that you can just do a blood test at home and they will tell you everything about anybody in your family, give you a whole tree of like where you come from, and that way you can still find out. So just speaking about, how many folds there are to this system and just how unregulated it is, because you can do just one of those tests at home and figure it out, even, if the person, the donor in question, never wanted it. The clinic will not reveal it to you still, because they still have to respect their terms and regulations, but you still might be able to find out. Also, I thought I would put this somewhere because I have kind of spotted it as a pattern through different documentaries and articles. But this should be your decision as a parent, as a potential parent, whether or not you want to opt in for the ID release option or non-ID release. If you are encouraged by the doctor themselves, get the hell out of there. Just, choose another clinic, because that is something that I have spotted in multiple of these cases. I hope it applies to early 90s, 70s, and 80s, but some of the parents were blatantly asked by their clinician, by the doctors, to sign a statement that it would be in their best interest, or the best interest of their child rather, to never ask about their biological dad in this case, but biological parent.
Toen heette dat het Zuiderziekenhuis. Toen heeft mijn vader en mijn moeder een verklaring van dokter Karbaat moeten tekenen. Dat het in mijn belang als kind zou zijn dat ik nooit zou gaan vragen wie de biologische vader was. De helft van jouw zijn ontbreekt.
It will come as no surprise that because of these poor regulations, because nothing is aligned absolutely in any country, none of the countries that I have read about is perfect in any way, shape or form. I'd like to think it is, but clearly some of them have more issues than the other. Read US, read Netherlands, still some cases happen there that I have read about recently, and like, what's going on? What still needs to be done? A lot of things. But because of the regulations, Jan Karbaat's case is not an isolated event. Since the first test tube baby in 1978, there were at least 30 cases of fertility fraud. And every single one of these fuckers, you can just have a blind lineup and tell the person like which one of these individuals you would think has like dozens of children somewhere. And they'll look it. It's like serial killers, you're like, no, you're dead behind the eyes. You look it. Like, none of them has game. None of them can actually pull a woman legally, consensually. And they're all creeps. They're all old creeps. It's actually fucking disgusting. The most famous one of these creeps is probably the guy called Cecil Jacobson, who lived in Virginia, operated there in 1980s, and he was found to be the biological father of at least 7 of his patients' children. This guy might have actually been a legitimate psychopath and we just never will know, because what he used to do, what his MO was injecting pregnancy hormone, HCG, into women, then misleading them, telling them that they were pregnant, and then a few months in, telling them that they weren't, in order to have the opportunity to inject them again, most probably with his own sperm. Different DNA tests have linked him to at least 17 children, but just like with Jan Karbaat, it is suspected that he had much more. In Cecil's case, it is suspected that he may have fathered as many as 75 children. Once discovered, he would be sentenced to 5 years in prison, and he was ordered to pay about $116,000 in fines and restitution to the former patients. But with Cecile, you really start to see the approach of the media, of everybody to this case, and that is that they have sensationalized the living shit out of it. They have called him the Sperminator. There was actually a documentary under the same name. Then there was a book in 1993 called Baby Maker. There was an SNL sketch about Cecile. And the women only found out when they agreed to genetic testing. And the problem here, beyond this being sensationalized and beyond people just making fun of it, not really realizing what the issue is the women, how women find out, which is going to be a prevalent thing in this story, that they only find out either when the kids do, and then they find out through a third party, usually a child, or when they agree to genetic testing. And the women are real victims in this case. And it's just an issue that people don't really speak about as often and as just strongly as they should. Another thing with Cecile is that he was tried on a federal level for fraud, for false pregnancies, for mail fraud, travel and wire fraud. He wasn't charged for fertility fraud. And none of these individuals, even though there's more than 30 cases of them worldwide, none of them would ever be charged for fertility fraud. Which, to me, and I'm gonna get backlash for this, but I'm just gonna say it, it is like downgrading rape to sexual assault. It is just that. It's just not calling it what it really is. It's not identifying the right crime. It's not calling hate crime a hate crime. It's just being like, oh no, it's actually just robbery, it's violence on the street against an individual. Well, it's targeted towards that individual because of their race, because they're minority, because of all of these issues. It's just not calling a spade, like call it for what it is, put it into law, and then you can adjust laws to match the actual crime. Because if you call it fraud on different levels, well then they're gonna get away with it as if it was just fraud, just, I don't know, stealing money from a company or something like that, not actually medically raping a patient. Faced with another lineup, here is another individual that inseminated his own patients with his own sperm. Donald Klein, seen here looking like he just shat himself, he used his own sperm in Indianapolis in 1970s and 80s, again fathering dozens of children. It only came to light that this is happening in 2014 when the DNA test kits that you could do at home started gaining in their popularity. And this led to the discovery of Klein having used his own sperm to fertilize the patient's eggs. This guy, beyond having the roundest face in the universe, also had a clear God complex, as clear as that freaking round-ass face that he had. He was well loved by everybody, well respected, just like Jan Karbaat, just like all of these fuckers. And when all of these patients who had done 23andMe tests actually started arranging meetings, they contacted him, and all of them arranged to meet up with him. His justification for doing this, for having dozens of children non-consensually, was that he just tried to help desperate patients. He actually told them the words, "I knew you in your mother's womb," which is, from what I read, a line from the Bible, but it just means that he put himself in the position of a god, because he was the one to ensure that they're actually brought into this world. I included Klein here because Indiana is actually quite interesting to look into. So when these charges against Klein were brought in 2014, well, he could only be charged with obstruction of justice, false advertising, and immoral conduct. He lost his license to practice medicine, luckily, but since then, Indiana picked up on how just outrageous this is, because it's actually insulting. Calling it false advertising, like this isn't just somebody putting a poster on the train that just says a different thing than it should. It's much, much worse than it. It's just so insulting towards the women, towards the actual patients. So the first law in the US came into effect in 2019 in Indiana as a result of Donald Klein. This new law made it a felony for a healthcare professional to make a misrepresentation relating to a medical procedure, device, or a drug. And the fertility law prohibits fertility doctors and specialists from introducing their own reproductive material, meaning sperm, or really eggs for that matter, but I suppose that would be harder, as well as medications or procedures to the patient without their full knowledge or consent. And I've seen that it's a level 6 felony, so I looked into what that actually means in terms of like time served. And a level 6 felony is still the lowest level of felony in Indiana. It can mean that a person either serves 2.5 years in prison, or they can pay up a fine of $10,000. And that's another thing where I feel personally, again, personal opinion, where these legislations should go is make at least them pay up some money, at least for some compensations for those families, especially the actual patients, direct patients, the mothers, but then also that would trickle down to the children. Make them pay up. Make them pay up, because this is the money-hungry industry and that's the only way that they will earn. Yes, their licenses still need to be taken away from them, but also hurt them where it really matters the most. Because as you go into this story, you realize that the motivations have to be monetary as well. Because the reasons why Jan Karbaat, why Donald Klein's, Cecilia Jacobsons of this world do this is in order for them then to be recommended to more and more people because of their success. Because when they inseminate all of these patients, they are going to become the most successful person, the pioneer in this industry. And obviously for Karbaat or for Cecile, for example, there is only a certain period where you can be considered a pioneer, which would have been late 70s, 80s, early 90s. And then after that, you're not a pioneer no more. This just exists. It is a common practice. So in that sense, then you have to step up. You have to advertise yourself in some way. And how do you do that if, you know, out of however many donors that walk in, you have all of these unsuccessful pregnancy attempts? And you realize, you know, at one point or another, you have used your own sperm and it worked. And then you just have a drive. I don't know. You just start doing it. You just start using your own sperm to inseminate your own patients. Other motives are that you are physically, as a professional here, inserting yourself into a person's life. The God complex, I suppose, that gives you has to be strong. It has to be powerful because they don't stop even after dozens and dozens of children. They can then continue doing this because of a particular conception of their role and fatherhood. The doctor knows best kind of mentality. Fulfilling some deep-seated psychological need and inability to stop practicing has to be taken into consideration because they never stop until they're caught. And that is just something that I find interesting. Like, you must, as somebody who is in that profession, be learning, honing in on all of these test kits that people can do at home, you know, all of these 23andMe and everything, and you never think like, okay, I should stop because they're gonna catch me out. I'm going to be caught. Well, you also don't stop because you probably know the laws and you know that it's just not illegal because the fertility fraud hasn't been put into law. And to finalize this section, another reason why there are no real movements when it comes to making laws about fertility fraud, you know, beyond Indiana, really, it is partially because of how victims are still being seen. I'm not victim blaming here, doing the complete freaking opposite, because I can't believe that we are speaking about this way in 2022. But there is stigma when it comes to fertility, inability to conceive, and then once these kind of cases are brought to public. So during every single stage of a fertility process or conception process, there is just stigma. So when it came to the Jan Karbaat's case, and you know, once that story broke out, then there was a stigma about why are people speaking up? Why are they the poster children? Why are they giving interviews? Do they want book deals? They just want media attention. They're just money hungry. Whereas you're not looking at the actual source of the problem, which is the doctor that has inseminated so many families. So they have to make their own case. The victims have to make their own case against the charges that are already in the law. So that kind of like adds an extra even step of difficulty because they have to prove that a crime had been committed. And when the laws aren't in place, then you can understand how some people think, well, women got what they wanted. They consented to the procedure, just not to the genetic material that was put inside of them. Meaning that the law is just decades behind of technology. And yet Elon Musk bought Twitter. Math ain't mathing. Math just ain't mathing somewhere. Some people just have insane amount of power. How did you bring Elon Musk into this? I had one safe space. I had one safe space and that's gone now. And that is because of Elon Musk. Putting that aside though, something that kept bothering me as well when it comes to the laws, there are no laws requiring disclosure of donor identity. If anything, it is actually discouraged. As I mentioned before, you know, if your clinician tells you, just I advise you never to disclose the identity of the child, like, run. Because why? I understand why you would, you know, choose non-ID release, like it's completely your choice. And I understand why they're not disclosed, the details of the donors are not disclosed until the child is of age. But at that point, the child is of age, so it is their decision to find out, obviously, if the donor chose that option. Because in my opinion, like, I understand why children shouldn't just be exposed to information, be super confused, well, when they're 5, completely get that. But if the parent wanted to maybe learn about the donor, to maybe have some more information, I feel like they should be able to, like there should be some sort of point where they can find out in order to prevent delaying exposure to these frauds, exposure to some things like this, which still happen. Like, we are here because fertility fraud still happens. In 2022, there was a headline, Netherlands fertility doctor used own sperm to father 21 children. Another headline from this year, a 4th Dutch gynecologist has been identified as having used his own sperm in fertility treatment during the 1970s and 1980s. It just isn't going away. That is the whole point of this ramble, and the laws need to catch up to the science. And they have to start catching up faster than they are right now. Because only 7 states, this is US, have passed the laws. So as of February 2022, 7 US states have passed the laws making fertility fraud a crime, and 7 others are still considering it. Because we are picking back up in this story with the records being kept poorly, this, according to the New York Times, is one of 2 main problems when it comes to sperm banks. And in my opinion, internationally and also in the US, this to me, when, now considering all of the legal issues that we have spoken about, means that people approach the regulations and even what is being brought into law in a wrong way. Because partially the industry is poorly regulated, meaning that there are multiple instances, like every single one of the cases we spoke about today, where careless records have been kept of the donors. This means that the women who buy this sperm may also be getting less than the quality that was advertised to them, because poor records mean that maybe the genetic matching that you have paid up extra for just isn't being done, meaning that you have actually been defrauded, because then your child is not going to look the way that you wanted them to look. And secondly, and this second law especially applies to the Netherlands, there is a shortage of donors, and this is kind of worldwide issue. When I looked into egg donation here in London, that is sort of their byline. That is what you see first on the website, where there is a shortage of egg donations, and you were encouraged to get in touch, to read up on the FAQs, and to be sort of in constant communication in order for that egg donation cycle to take place in the intended time frame, which can last between 3 and 6 months from, again, what I've read. So it is a long process that other people, have to follow up. There's a lot of admin, and that's again why a lot of things do get unnoticed. But because of the donor shortage in the Netherlands, the government passed 2 laws that resulted in the donors kind of being put off donating. So the first one was passed in 1996, forbidding men from being paid to donate sperm. And then the second one was passed in 2004, allowing the children of sperm bank donors to find their biological dads after the children turn 16. Meaning that non-ID release donors just aren't really possible in the Netherlands. And the first point is actually, from, again, what I have read, more widespread than Netherlands. Sperm donations are actually paid a lot less compared to egg donations. Here in the UK, egg donation, £750 per cycle, successful cycle, so the woman has to actually be impregnated. Sperm donations, £35. So technically they're doing this just to cover the expenses. I don't know, in my mind, I'm not sure, does that mean that the sperm donations aren't paid per cycle, rather it is per donation, so that kind of it can equate, or still it would be less, but not that significantly less. But I mean, it happens because of these cases, in order to discourage cases of fertility fraud happening like that. But you can see how when you see that kind of difference as a male, you are discouraged from actually going in and donating your own sperm, because that amount of money just doesn't make any difference in your life. If you have not skipped that whole timestamp, what a trooper. But that brings us to 2014, roughly. With the rise of 23andMe, with the rise of ancestry tests, many Americans, and then it would spread worldwide, started taking these at-home DNA tests. And for some, these results ended up in the kids finding out they have all of these siblings, half-brothers and half-sisters that they have never ever heard of. And in other cases, it would directly link them to their father. And then they would find out that the father was the actual doctor, the respected individual that inseminated their mom. And that brings us back to our story, picking up where we left it off. So we know in Esther's case, she found out that the records have been poorly kept. She's just trying to find out the identity of the donor, of the father of her kids, because the kids are asking her to. So she's making phone calls, making email requests, she's filling out forms, doing anything possible. And around this time, so between 2014 to 2017, roughly, the rumors are going rife. There's just spread of rumors because now people are catching up. All of those kids from the 80s, from the 90s, they're now of age. They're 16 and over, and a lot of them want to learn who their father is. So a lot of people, starting off with the parents now because they know which clinic they attended to, start having suspicions about Karbaat. The rumors mainly started with the kids doing these at-home test kits, finding out that they have all of these half-brothers, half-sisters, calling them out of the blue, getting in touch with them, and basically asking them, hey, do you know who your father is? Oh, you don't. Do you know where your mother has been conceived at? Okay, same clinic. Cool, 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 cool. And then once there was enough of those kids, a group of these families contacted a lawyer. And they actually spent like a year and a half looking for a lawyer that would take this case. Because remember, if you have listened through that whole timestamp, fertility fraud, not a crime. So they're looking into how they can even go about this. With the kids now having legal representation, the lawyer starts getting in touch with Karbaat. He would write him a letter, and Karbaat said that he actually lost the ability to have kids due to his prostate, so that he couldn't be a father. Meaning that all of these kids between, early 2010s and at this point 2016, 2017, still have only rumors. They can still only ring up their half-brother, half-sister and have that rumor of like, oh yeah, my mom went to the clinic, it could be the doctor, but they don't know it for sure because all of those tests can't actually confirm that for sure until they were to obtain the doctor's DNA. And this is where this story really goes, because Karbaat still is alive at this point. He is still living at that Stork building, that huge house where the clinic was based at some point as well, with the lawyers on his case. The lawyer actually wrote him a letter saying that he should get in touch with his insurance because there's a crime here. They're planning to bring this to the court. And then the lawyer on this podcast episode said that they have actually spoken with Karbaat on the phone, and he just sounded completely unfazed, like he just didn't really care. And in a matter of months, they found out that maybe he knew that the end was near. Because in 2017, at the age of 89, Jan Karbaat was dead. And even once the news came out, it was all like a speculation. The lawyer found out from like the context, but it wasn't actually published for weeks. The family just kept it a secret. And in my opinion, this is, as we will go further in this story, again, just another power trip by this whole family. Just still to have some power over this case, even in his death. It's sickening. So at this point, 23 people in the Netherlands still want to continue with this case. And they have three options, because they still are after Karbaat's DNA to finally know for sure whether or not this man was their dad, and then to pursue it legally again in order to get some compensation, something, because now he can't face charges because he fucking dropped dead like a little coward. So the options that they had was to dig up his corpse, probably the most difficult one out of them all, to ask on TV for their family members to come forward and give their own DNA to be compared then to Jan's and against their children's. And they actually, from my understanding, did this, but the family members, none of them responded. All of them were completely silent. Which, like, what are you hiding? How many people knew of this in his family? As we will learn, some of them definitely, but just his wife, I'm like, I don't know, woman. Did you know? Because his previous wives, you're spoiling the whole story. The third option was for the judge to give permission to go to his house, give a warrant for his house to be searched. Now, before giving Karbaat a place in this story, a place on the stage that he definitely does not deserve, but desperately wished for, let us give everybody else a priority. So, giving you differing opinions here from the highlights of the podcast mostly, and also certain articles online. The opinions from this point on really are either the angle of the mothers and how they feel, and then the angle of the children, and sort of differing opinions that they might have. So, considering Esther, and that is where that story has started, let us sort of analyze the opinions that Esther had compared to her children. Esther would say, he made me a mother. He gave me these wonderful children, but he was also arrogant and a narcissist. He seems to have thought he was better than other donors, that he was doing women a favor to get them pregnant using his sperm. When it comes to her son, the one who really wanted to find out who his father was, he actually said, and this is at a point in 2017 when they still didn't know for sure whether or not it was Jan Karbaat, but the suspicions were there. So the son said that he decided to become a sperm donor himself, that it just made perfect sense, because he knows that any children that are born as a result will be able to find him in the future, and he sort of wants to avoid that non-ID release that resulted in this. So he feels if he is able to help them, he will understand their situation in a way that some donors can't, because he has been through everything that they are going through, so he will be able to relate. Now, as you can expect, not everybody shares such positive, wholesome views. A lot of people that have been interviewed in this case actually share the complete opposite, complete resentment, and justifiably so. So, to give you the insight, the podcast Immaculate Deception spoke with one of the mothers. They traveled all the way to Spain to speak to Lydia. Lydia's story is that she was born and raised in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and then in the 70s she had a hard life when it comes to her family. So she left her school at the age of 13, she then took care of her whole family. She did housework, looked after her brothers, and then, a few years later, she gets her first office job, meets the co-worker's brother, and sees her way outside of that house. With a ticket to get out of the house, however, she also did want her own family. So her and her husband tried for the baby for months. She goes to a doctor, she goes to actual hospital. They kind of tell her, just give it a year. It's all going to work out. But then, a year later, it doesn't. She said, even for, this being the 80s at this point, she was prodded. She had all sorts of invasive procedures. She tried everything. She even would read, the old wives' tales and then drink herbal tea in order to try something. But just no baby. Every single procedure resulted in her not getting pregnant. And let me tell you, that glitch meant that I lost the notes for this episode, meaning that I had to re-listen to that podcast episode all over again, and I'm just gonna tell you, it does not make it any easier. It does not make it any lighter, because it just emphasizes the stigma that these women go through, because they feel like they are the problem. Always initially, and even today, and that is so saddening that even today, in this day and age, the woman would be considered the problem. The last thing they would do is check the man, check his sperm, check his sperm count and whether or not he is the one that might be the issue. So she was prodded, she was checked, and after they literally exerted every single option, then they found out, after examining her husband, that he was the one that was infertile. So at first, she felt shame, but then once they realized the husband is the issue, they remember somebody told them about Karbaat. And, once there is such a hard issue when it comes to these cases, that these families, you know the people that have the maternal instinct. Because if these kind of families, if these types of prospective mothers and fathers are in your friend circle, you know how much they want to have a child. And that's where the injustice just is beyond me. That these types of families can't conceive their own biological children. Rather have to resort to this when they're at their most desperate, at their most vulnerable, because they have exerted every single other option that they had. So Lydia was in this position, and there was only one option left. So Karbaat promised the same old. He is going to screen for a perfect match. Somebody who didn't inseminate more than 20 women, she's gonna get the fresh sperm and get her pregnant as soon as possible. Lydia would say about her experience of going into Karbaat's clinic that she never felt comfortable, first of all. She always wore oversized dresses in order not to feel sexualized. She said that he gave her the creeps and that she was intentionally hiding her body because of him. Sometimes she would say that, other people were helping her, inseminating her, going through the cycle, but sometimes Karbaat would do it himself. And in those instances, she said that he tried to touch her breast. There were no CCTVs. Back then, he could get away with everything like that. And that he was just constantly crossing the boundaries. He would be in the room commenting about how other women at the clinic, other nurses and doctors just smell nice. They look nice today, don't they? And you're like, I'm literally here, desperate for one single reason: stop being a fucking pervert. So 2 years after she would go to Karbaat, she got pregnant. In 1982, Lydia gave birth to a son. And 2 years after that, the husband and the wife, wanted another child. So on this occasion, Karbaat told her that he was using the same donor. At least he doesn't lie, he just doesn't tell them that he is the donor himself. So Lydia suffered a miscarriage here, and then it was followed by another son. Now, as soon as she gave birth to the second child, she noticed that this kid was nothing like the first son that she had. The first one, she noticed kind of some narcissistic traits, and he resulted in being a bodybuilder. People started commenting on the lack of personal resemblance pretty soon, just like it so happens in so many of these cases. So Jan was the person to say in between these kids that it's better for the children not to know that their donor conceived. However, then Lydia's husband ended up dying suddenly. And on his deathbed, he made Lydia promise not to tell the kids. But the husband had colon cancer. So the older son, after his dad's death, thinking that this is still his biological dad, thought that the colon cancer would be hereditary. So he wanted to get the test done and, thought he was going to get cancer himself. And from what I believe I've heard, Lydia still didn't tell him. Rather, it was the son who called her in 2019 when they finally found out that it was Jan Karbaat for sure. So Lydia was left with this feeling that she thought it was her fault, but also you can't wish that it didn't happen. You can't wish it didn't because it brought you the children that you so desperately wanted. So you're just stuck in such an impossible situation. Like, your thought process just must be so insane once you actually find out, because you have the family that you wanted, but you still feel just dirty. You feel like you have been medically raped, which you have been. On that note, on feeling dirty, feeling abused, Lydia actually pointed to something that I have read elsewhere while researching this. It wasn't mentioned by anybody else on the podcast, but this makes me think that this is also a pattern. And that was that beyond him just being a creep, touching her breast, her just trying to look as unappealing as possible when going to be inseminated, Karbaat would kind of go into the next room. And then he would come back. And she would say that he would come back with a fresh sperm. I don't have to spell it out. I don't have to spell out what this means. Also, I have looked into how, sperm preservation actually happens, the freezing of the sperm, and I'll put some screenshots on the screen in order not to go through this, just because at least it looks cool to me in terms of like the freezing of the sperm, putting it into those coolers. You try to do everything to make the sperm not THAO, T-H-A-O, basically trying to preserve it. You don't want it to melt. You don't, from at least what I have read, somebody correct me if I'm scientifically wrong, you don't want it to feel warm. You don't want it to feel like somebody has just been to the next room in order to provide that genetic material, in order to wank and then come in and put it into a syringe in order to inseminate you. That's not really what you want at all, but it felt like that for so many women. Lydia also said, and then the podcast host kind of confirmed this, this isn't just the issue for the mothers. When Lydia was interviewed, her second husband was actually there present, translating some bits of the interview, and he said that Karbaat is the constant presence in the fathers' lives as well. And then, the podcast host, Jenny, actually asked, like, why do you think the fathers aren't reaching out? Because she got in touch with a couple of mothers, and in the documentaries, it is usually the mothers giving the interviews. But why do the fathers never give any interviews? Or stepfathers, the second husbands of the women? And it is probably, again, to do with the shame, to do with that whole stigma of, well, the fathers couldn't be the donors in the first instance, couldn't be the biological fathers, but then also after. But now Jan Karbaat is the constant presence in everybody's lives, in the children, since they learned who the donor potentially was, in the women who were victimized, and also in sort of the secondary victims here, which are the dads. And it would be interesting, really, as the podcast host commented, to find out a perspective of a father here, beyond Lydia's second husband, who just said, like, I don't want to hear about this guy sometimes, like, who is he? He literally is such an overpowering figure in this woman's lives after so many years, and this is after so many years that she is finding out. And, he just feels like, who is he? He is just a donor. He was never a father, he was not a stepfather, he was never present for this child. So why is he here? Why is he just like a ghost from the past hovering over our lives? Most of the moms, however, will agree that the kids are the ones that are lucky, because many of them discover that they have all of these half-brothers, half-sisters, and that they just can then, liaise with them. They can then contact them, travel places, find out that they have this huge family. However, that the women, the mothers, are still victims, and they're just left behind then, sort of just thinking about why this could happen. What did they do to deserve this? Why they weren't more careful? What could have they done back in the day in order for this not to happen? So when it comes to the children themselves, again, most of them, yes, think this way as well. That they are lucky, they make contact with their half-brothers and sisters. For most of them, this is how they actually even figure this out to begin with. So let's consider Inge. Inge was 39 when Jan Karbaat came into her life in some form. She lived in Rotterdam herself, and this is where Karbaat's clinic was based. And then she was out of the blue contacted by another guy who gave a ton of interviews in this case, called Joey. She was called by Joey, who told her he took a DNA test and he thinks he's her half-brother. When Inge took a DNA test and she found out that yes, this is indeed true, that they are like half-brother and sister, she said, when you don't know who your father is, like at that point, even when Jan died, you fantasize. It can be John Bon Jovi for Inge, it can be whoever the hell you want it to be. And then it turns out to be Karbaat, and you're just like, why me? Like, it's so disappointing. Look at this creep. Like, why? Why him out of all of the people, all of the options that could have been? So Inge said that for her, she had another dad. She was actually brought up by somebody. So she never felt connection with anybody else. She never felt like there was a need for another father figure. So sometimes when she met up new people who kind of looked a little similar to her, she starts wondering, could they be my half-sibling as well? And that is the true pain of this, is that some people will just never know. They might still think that their dad is their biological dad. Might be so many other reasons why they won't take a DNA test and won't figure out that they have all of these half-brothers, half-sisters. Joey, on the other hand, has a completely different perspective. The one that I actually feel is the most common in this case. So we learn about him from the podcast. We learned that his parents told him that his mom was artificially inseminated by his dad's sperm. But then he starts growing up and, just like everybody, starts noticing differences between him and his siblings at first, and then all of the personality traits start coming to light. Joey also noticed significant differences between him and his supposed dad. Like, his dad was completely careless, he would fall into debts, he would go in and out of prison, the furniture would be seized, so he kind of lived in a very unstable household. So by the time when he was 19, he was in a stable relationship, he left this household behind, but still just didn't feel like this was alright, because he saw, that he was a control freak, he saw all of these different personality traits in him, and he kind of started nagging his mom, asking him about whether or not this might or might not be my dad. And this is when the mom told him about a doctor named Jan. And this doctor apparently lived and operated from a suburb close to where Joey was brought up. But then Joey turns to the internet, he starts Googling, and he keeps seeing these articles about the rumors. And then in 2017, he does a Google search again, and here comes a news report. He sees a picture of a doctor that ran the clinic. And from what I reckon, this was the picture of Jan Karbaat in his younger days. So immediately Joey is like, this man looks so much like me, rather I look so much like him. I have his face, the smile, the look in the eyes. So he decides to just test it out. He basically takes a screenshot of, saves a picture that he found in that article and sends it in a WhatsApp group to his friends. And his friend's response, without him saying anything, was, "Is that you, Joey?" This led Joey to start buying all of these DNA tests, and by doing that he uncovered dozens of half-brothers and half-sisters. And it just so happened that Rita Karbaat, Jan Karbaat's wife, actually went to Joey's gym. So once, he honed in that he has all of these half-brothers and half-sisters, the mom mentioned name Jan, and he started looking into it, he actually went to the clinic to speak with Rita, and he tells her he knows for sure, he's bluffing, but he tells her he knows for sure that he is the son of Karbaats. She was also welcoming, just like Karbaat. It's just some level of denial, just thinking they're gonna get away with all of this, which so far unfortunately they did. She told him to come back, she can even give him a tour. Now, this isn't clarified because from the records this is happening in 2017, and from what I have read online, Jan's clinic was already shut at this point. In this BBC article, it says it was shut in 2009. So I'm thinking, were they bluffing? Was Rita just bluffing that this is still operational, it's still completely legal, there are no issues here, just to sort of shush him, get him to forget about it, thinking he's not going to return? What do you think? Because I'm just thinking, because in different articles also it says that the clinic has been shut. In the BBC one in 2009 and then another one in 2015. So if the clinic is not operational, how are they thinking they're gonna get away with this? Whatever the reason was, a few days later he actually read the news that Jan Karbaat died at the age of 89. The clinic was shut whichever year it was. I don't know if BBC is wrong or if the other article is wrong. So whether it is 2009 or 2015, the clinic was shut because of poor record keeping, which doesn't come as a surprise. And also, it doesn't come as a surprise that it wasn't because Jan decided suddenly he doesn't have a god complex and he is going to make amends, or, I don't know, make reparations, compensate people. He didn't come to his senses, is what I'm saying. He was only stopped from doing what he was doing, not even because of his old age, not because of the retirement, purely because somebody else honed in, probably filed a couple of complaints, and he had to be stopped. where this left so many of these children in 2017 and all the way up until 2019, but especially this period after Jan's death, is knowing that, you know, they are half siblings, but not sure whether or not Jan is their dad. But it's this state of paranoia, because they don't know how many of them are there. So like Joey says about how many times he would, I don't know, match up on Tinder with somebody, go to a party and he'd meet his half-brother and he'd be like, what the fuck, this is insane. Like, imagine ending up dating a half-sibling of yours and not realizing. Like, that is just one of the repercussions, but it's so real because Netherlands isn't huge, and also, you know, if people still remain in this Rotterdam area where he operated, the chances are you're gonna go to somebody's house party and meet like half of your half sibling. It's insane. I don't know. I just find that so scary that men just don't think. Doctors, clinicians just never thought about this. They're like, no, I'm just inseminating you. You can date whoever the fuck you want. You can date your half siblings and then what? Commit incest and have a child that is a product. Just please make it make sense, because I just can't. For Joey, this resulted in him having a completely different opinion than Esther's son did. He just doesn't want to have his own children. He feels like he is the result of human mass production, something like a clone. He says a lot of brothers and sisters want to break the chain of Karbaat's heritage. And that is just so sad. That you think like, you know, you might start dating your brother and sister and have to do DNA tests to figure out whether or not they are your sibling, and then to just think, I don't want to continue this chain because of all of the negative personality traits, because of narcissism, because you are a control freak, because you see yourself having potentially a god complex to some degree and you don't want another child to have that. Once you have these different angles from mothers and the victims of Jan Karbaat and then the children, the podcast actually exceeded themselves and offered us such a bizarre opinion, and that is the one of a donor, but not just any donor, a super donor called Louis, who knows of at least 17 children that he fathered himself. So Louis' story came about from this Polish journalist who started looking into Karbaat and actually started from Louis. So the focus of the book that he had written, and I think is only translated in a few languages and English isn't one of them, from what I have looked into, the focus is on Louis and his children and his story, and then Karbaat was kind of like a secondary person because he was the doctor, so he found out some information about Karbaat, but mostly it was based on Louis. So the way that Louis perceives the doctor, Jan Karbaat, was as a visionary and an idealist. He, according to Louis, was improving quality of life, giving others the opportunity to have children. So the only way he can feel about Karbaat was to be thankful to him, because his own children make his life much happier.
There was, in 2014, there was an article about there was this article, which was very tabloid-like, so the sperm mafia leaking sperm tanks of Dr. Jan Karbaat. That was kind of weird to read. But I found it interesting. I was a little bit into this sensational story of a donor who has supposedly has 200 children. He was half Dutch, half Surinamese, and some of those families didn't really expect babies to be like they were some of them were white, some of them were a little darker, but some of those families didn't expect that. So that was the first trace of that. And then it turned out that the donor passports that were used by Jan Karbaat, so the doctor, the boss of the clinic in Barendrecht near Rotterdam, that those passports didn't really like almost all of them were made up or didn't really make any sense. Then there was this interview with the guy I later called Louis, because I changed his name, so the half Surinamese donor, and he was saying some weird things that he feels he's very powerful, and that having 200 children is like, you know, a bigger power than having 2 children. So I was really surprised reading that. And I decided to write an article about it.
Hearing that, you might think like, this guy is delusional, and kind of is. But you kind of need to see the dynamic between Karbaat and these donors. And, you know, Camille gives us that perspective into it, because he has obviously extensively researched Louis. So the idea of Louis seeing Karbaat as a hero is probably a distant concept to you, but then you have to think about how these donors must have been treated, especially like 70s to 90s, when everything goes, where there's no CCTV, when a person can just walk in through the back door, sees, you know, all of this technology, which Louis did, you know, how this sperm is preserved, see the whole process. Even once they decide to move on, they are given like gifts, they're given the goodbye cards, they're treated so well. They're treated very well by Jan Karbaat, and they're respected by that whole clinic. So that is exactly what happened to Louis. In 1974, he was in his early 20s, and he read this article about this pioneering technology, the artificial insemination. This, like with so many donors, woke something up in Louis. He saw a possibility. He had that light bulb moment that this is what he needs to do. The motivation behind Louis' actions would be that he had Asperger's, which is the form of autism, meaning that he couldn't really relate to others, so he never felt like he would be able to have his own family in the traditional way, and then who is going to remember him once he's gone? But this article and the clinic seemed to give him a chance to create a family that he never thought he could. He started calling up some numbers, finding out about sperm banks, and this is how he learned about Karbaat's clinic. So sometimes he would say he just started going in, he would go in 2 times, 3 times a week, and then it became a routine. And this is probably how Karbaat himself, because he was a donor in his own way, also treated it psychologically. Because Louis said, you know, he would produce sperm before breakfast, he would keep it warm. He used to come in just, you know, it would be like a regular thing. He goes in, produces sperm, let's say it that way, and then just goes back out, goes to work. Karbaat would even allow him to use the back entrance in order to protect the donor's anonymity. Louis would repeat this routine 2 or 3 times a week for the next 12 years. And the only reason why he stopped is that he actually got a girlfriend in 1995. Now the clinic here, once they heard, you know, they sort of gave him a farewell, they bought him some flowers, some coupons for some discounts, and a few years later, they sent him a request. You know, at this point they're like, hey, there's a family, you know, they're looking for this particular genetic match. Would you like to donate again as such well-respected donor? And Louis at this point had that relationship ended, so he does return. He would say that nobody told him ever that there were any limits, ever limitations in the amount of families that you can have. In fact, he said that Jan Karbaat called him back himself. His hope was to be able to one day find all of his children and then make them his heirs, because that was his original motivation for actually even donating his sperm. But after a few years, it's just a pattern. He didn't see it as creating human beings, which is so bizarre, like how detached you can be from that action, but also how involved you want to be, or rather how involved you want to see yourself as. Camille, this journalist that researched on Louis, said that Louis never seemed to have any regrets. He didn't see anything wrong with this whole situation. Even he said that he is the sun and his children are the orbs. So the children are circling and then the other ones are just passing through solar system and never coming back. Just again kind of emphasizing on the God complex here. He also said to Camille that he is grateful to Karbaat because he did the right things, he just might have gone about them in the wrong way. He was just too keen to help all of these families, but he never broke the first rule of show business, which is never to disappoint your audience. They will get children. They want children, they will get children. He was not a showman, he was not a comedian, he was not a stand-up artist. And just nobody sees that. It's just so sensationalized in so many accounts that people just cannot see reason, cannot see sense. With all of these different perspectives, we go back into the story and we pick up with the happy days of Jan Karbaat biting the dust, him being dead, and the family starting to think that they're gonna have to dig his corpse up because nothing else seems to be working. But then 2 weeks after his death, that warrant to search his house was actually granted. So they knock on the door and, you know, Rita and the other family members are saying, no, we're not allowing it, but it's a warrant, so you don't really have much say. So they go through his house and they have the right to seize the items, but they still don't have the right to use them. So whatever they are picking up, they're putting into this safe. And among all of these things, they take his comb, they take his toothbrush, and they take this nose trimmer, hair nose trimmer. It's a bit on the nose, I had to include it, it had to be done. It was kept in the safe because the judge at this point still thought there was insufficient evidence to allow for any further tests. But then 2 years pass, and in February 2019 there was a big win for all of the Karbaat's children, because the judge finally ruled in the favor of the claim. This meant that because Jan Karbaat used his own sperm without announcing it at the time, without asking for consent, his widow and other heirs cannot claim that the doctor's anonymity should be respected, meaning that finally all of those items could be tested, and finally all of those children had the answer of whether or not Jan was their father. And it makes me insanely happy, and I want to know what you guys think, but the power of numbers had won. Like, had he just stopped, had he maybe just stopped at like 1 or 2 kids, maybe we wouldn't be here today. Maybe nobody would have uncovered this story, or nobody would have thought that it's too sensational to cover, to speak about, to publish articles on. But because he couldn't stop, because of his God complex, we are here. And all of those kids have the answer. I just like how karma works around. Because of the power of the numbers, he lost. And that was his own it's just so beautiful when it happens. Even after this plaintiff, even after this lawsuit, dozens of people still don't know for sure whether or not Jan is the dad. And because it wasn't a litigation on behalf of the parents, it denies them the status of victimhood. So all of those moms still can't have the victimhood status, still can't be considered to be victims. Joey says that for him, the justice looks like an apology. Not just from Jan's family, but also from the government, because this was happening under their supervision. And for his mom and other moms, for the actual real victims here, financial compensation, because everybody's lives have been affected. You know, Jan is the overpowering presence in everybody's lives, in their whole family. The fathers and the stepfathers and the new husbands, they hear about this story from the woman that they have met, from the real victim. The victims can't think that this is something that shouldn't have happened because it gave them kids, but still can't be looked at as victims, or just like survivors of this man and his practice. And then the kids have to go constantly through their life thinking, do I want to continue this man's legacy, this man's genes, this man's line? Do I want to date somebody? Do I have to have a DNA test in order to date them, you know, so that they're not like related to me? It's just such a mindfuck. So that is where the case stands as of today. The victim seeking some sort of financial compensation. I have checked as to where this is now in terms of like, has anything happened, but I don't see that anybody has been compensated. If you are Dutch and, you know, might have found out any recent articles, let me know, because I would like to know, again, what kind of compensation this is, whether they will ever get it. I really hope they do, because again, just hurt the family. We're gonna talk about Karbaat now, and I don't believe that nobody in his life knew what he was doing. I just don't believe it, considering the man was also creep in his personal life. So who was Jan Karbaat, and why do we think that he did this? Karbaat, you will see from the story of Camille, again, and the interview that he gave for the podcast, already had his heirs. He already had biological children. So he couldn't have had the same reason as Louis. He clearly had some luck in his personal life because, according to the podcast, Rita, his wife at the time of his death, was his third wife. But then, according to other sources, she might have been his fifth. And when it comes to his children, he might have had 22 of his own biological children, and then all of the others that have been confirmed, totaling at the time of the podcast, where, you know, all of these kids have learned that he was their dad for sure, at least 80 children. At least 80, and the podcast came out in 2020. So by this point it could be in the 200s, and we just might never know. But before the children, before the marriages, who was Karbaat and why fertility? Why pioneer in this particular field? Jan was born in 1927. We don't really know much about his childhood, but we know that he did study in medical school. And after that, he figured he didn't really have any job opportunities. So he moved to Suriname. Then he moved around, he lived in South America, and this would be 1950s. So he lived as part of this Dutch colony, and he was an army doctor. And this is where his career, rather his medical career, would begin. And it starts off as some sort of legend that is then to be passed on from father to son for generations. Because according to Jan, two poor women knocked on his door, telling him that their husbands are infertile, and there's a lot of shame and stigma about this topic. So they tell him what they want their child to look like, right? Like to resemble the father, so nobody asks any questions. And Jan, in his mind, says, oh my god, I know just like a perfect man. He knew of this chauffeur who had dark features but blue eyes. And next day, Jan is just chasing this man. He is asking him, I need your sperm. It's as simple as that. It has never been done before, but Jan is going to be pioneer in this industry. And he has been seen as pushing boundaries ever since. This would be 50s, then 60s. As I mentioned, this hasn't been seen as a crime yet, and nobody really knows what to do. At best, it would have been seen as adultery by doctor. So sort of like adultery by proxy. And patients had to trust their doctor is behaving ethically. They couldn't confirm it by any means, and the donors' names were not revealed to them. So he would return to Netherlands, and this is where he would live with his family. He would start the biggest abortion clinic to begin with, and he would work at a hospital in fertility kind of department. He soon made a name for himself and was pictured in front of freezers full of sperm. He was considered a pioneer in this industry. In some sources, in the podcast, I have heard that he left the hospital. In some articles, I have heard that he might have actually been fired. But whichever way, he decides to open his own fertility clinic. So, gone complex either way. He worked on abortions and then suddenly he decides to completely switch directions. You might think that the reasons are personal. He would, even in the interview with Camille, which also happened when he was old and was supervised by Rita, who was actually his wife at the time and also the assistant at the clinic, he would say that the maximum number of children per donor would be 18, that he knows of.
Donor in his clinic. The answer was very weird.
Je mocht 18 patiënten per donor gebruiken. En dan waren die donoren maar goed.
And what about documentation? He was like, 18. So at that point, I knew that he's lying. I remember that the ministry did control the paperwork after they closed it down in 2010. And they realized it's just impossible to tell which donor and which child are connected. The so-called documentation was just like nothing. I asked him also about the whole discussion, identity discussion, so people who are trying to get this information, who is the biological father, and he told me that he didn't think about it.
And through his career, because he is a pioneer, but he's also a professional, right? He just got the feel from trying to reveal identity to some parents and introducing even a donor to a woman once, that just isn't how this should work. So the woman was apparently disappointed with the donor, and then he didn't really want to reveal his identity to anybody from that point on, because again, he decides on that. Not the law. No, he is the law at his own clinic. So he had to do everything in order to avoid any potential harm to the patients, because he cared about them so much. Yet again, because of this huge care that he had about his trade, about this business, during his career, Karbaat might have actually brought sperm to the US. And there's just no way to know how many kids he might have there, that again won't ever question it, won't ever know whether or not they are connected to Jan. And the podcast even mentions that maybe some of them might even be in Middle East. His trips to these countries, and rather not just his trips, but if he actually managed to go through the airports and bring sperm across, is just concerning on so many other levels, but especially about those kids maybe never being connected to Jan Karbaat, because the matches might not be as clear due to different tests abroad, DNA databases would be different. You know, even 23andMe or Ancestry, are they comparing it with every single part of the world? Private databases, depending on where you take those tests, are they sharing data with one another? And then one of the kids at least would have to go abroad, start living in the US, and then enter their own DNA into the American database for something like that to even happen. And when he wasn't inseminating the women at his own clinic, or possibly even abroad based off of different theories, he would, in his personal life, as mentioned, have a couple of wives, and then a couple of children with each and every one of those wives. A legal biological child of Karbaat's actually had given his DNA. He volunteered themselves in order to help out during 2017 when all of this was happening. And he was the one who provided them with the important clue that, you know, Karbaat might actually be their dad. He did it because he was fed up with his dad getting away with everything. And there was a recording that was made available through WhatsApp groups and that reached Joey eventually. And in this secret recording that was made 5 years before Jan's death, they back up the amount of children that he might have had officially. The recording mentions that Rita might have actually been his 5th wife, and that he had 5 kids with all of them. So the total number is either 22 plus kids that are his biological children. That number of his biological children, along the number of the children that were conceived at the clinic, that at the time when this story was exposed was around 60, well, totals the number of Karbaatians, as they're known online, at least 80 plus, because men will rather father over 80 children, have extramarital affairs, father them through artificial insemination, then go to therapy. Yeah. Keep an eye on your grandpa, your cute little grandpa, yeah, while your grandma is making lunch in the kitchen. Where is he? Is he at the clinic next door? Is your grandpa a pervert? That is the question that I'm asking you today. Because this man, by all accounts, started off in his 60s. Like, he worked for the hospital, for the abortion clinic before that, but he was the pioneer in the industry, and all of the accounts say that he had his own clinic only when he was in his 60s, and then all the way up until his 80s, and really until he was shut down. He just didn't stop, which is just so creepy. Like, why do you start in your 60s after you have all of these biological children? Because by this point he would have had all of these marriages and all of these children, and then he just decided to do this. I just don't know what level you need, but you definitely have a pattern on why he was doing that. And I want to ask you, do you think that Rita knew that his wives, his previous wives, other biological children that maybe didn't speak up like that one, did they know? Because I just find it impossible that they didn't. I just can't imagine that, you know, it came as a surprise to them when these rumors started circulating. Because we all know that when men are considered to be a creep by one person, they're just a creep. It's a pattern. It shows you're uncomfortable when you are in the room with him, let alone when you live with one such man. At the time that Jan Karbaat sat with this Polish journalist Kamil, his glory days were over. He was in the motorized chair for the last few months of his life, and he could never have predicted the world of DNA tests. And then once they came around, he just shrugged it off, knowing that he might not be there once the truth is unraveled, and trying to postpone so desperately for as much as possible for the truth to really come out and for his DNA to be tested. And in the interview, apparently with Camille, he said he doesn't even believe in DNA testing. And when Camille asked him, did he use his own sperm, he didn't even utter a response. He just shrugged it off. There are a lot of different opinions on Jan Karbaat beyond what I have offered today, but most people agree that he was a donor, but never a father. He was a sorry excuse for a donor as well, because he never respected his patients enough to own up to his actions, not allowing the resolution for so many families. In the end, it would be the power in the numbers that will ensure that justice is served. For the man thinking he was undefeatable, Jan Karbaat got overpowered by the byproduct of his own trade. Let me know if you agree, but that is the story of Jan Karbaat and the immaculate deception. Why do you think he did it? Like, is it a drive? Like, can you just not stop until you get caught? Is it like, on some level, very diminished level, the way that serial killers think, that something just drives them? It is that God complex that you think you decide on the fate of the people. It reminds me kind of, yeah, now that I mentioned serial killer, it just popped into my head. You know the injustice killers, or whatever the fuck they're called? The ones that think they're cleaning up the streets, you know, usually in context of sex workers. Or they think like, well, nobody is going to exterminate pedophiles or whatever, and then they just commit crimes because it's for the good reason, right? Like with Karbaat here, who else was going to help donate sperm for so many families? I'm helping desperate women without consent. So let me know what you think about this story or many others, and if you don't want to listen to the personal part of it, bye. Like and subscribe and share, and I will see you next time. Can you tell how exhausted I fucking am? Well, the personal part of this story is about my own experience. It's really a beginning of experience when it comes to the egg donation. So as I mentioned, in the UK, you can donate up to 10 times, meaning 10 families, because again, you never know, you know, whether the donation cycle will result in somebody having one child or many. And I also mentioned the expenses for the donors. So the men are paid basically just for the expenses, so £35. And then egg donors are paid £750 per cycle. So, as you know, I don't really share my personal experiences here, but I kind of decided to re-listen to Immaculate Deception as well, because I started looking into egg donation, as in donating my own eggs. And I'm gonna share my own motives, because this story really made me think about them and like why I actually wanted to do it for the past year or two. Like, it was just like in my mind, but I never actually went online, researched, read FAQs, checked even if I could. I'm still really not sure. I filled out the form, but I'm still not sure if they're going to inquire further into like my family history, because again, it was kind of just like tick box kind of form. And, you know, I could have lied, I didn't, but I could have, and then what, like, you end up having a child with, like, defects when people lie. And again, I have, as I mentioned through my previous videos, I have had family members that have had cancer, so of course I might not even be a potential donor. I'm still in the process of finding out whether that is the option. Now, I won't lie, and that's why I stated, like, the monetary reasons. That is kind of down my list of motivations. The number one motive is to do with ego. It is to do with wanting to pass my own genes, wanting to have like a miniature me. But unlike Karbaat, I know that having no maternal instinct and wanting to have a child just in order to pass your genes on doesn't make you a mother and wouldn't make me a good one. That brings me to my second main reason, and that is the sense of justice, or rather hating the injustice, hating that some people can so easily conceive and they don't want it. I don't know if that would have been my case, but again, probably would. And then there's so many people that really desperately want to have families for all the good reasons, for all the ethical reasons, and they can't. And that pisses me off. And that is the problem where I feel I can step in if, again, fertile, which I don't know if I am, but I feel like that would at least help me kind of have peace with that, because I'm at least contributing to somebody else having what they desperately want and somehow, for some reason, can't have. And then the last reason on my list would be the monetary reason, and because the egg donors are paid £750, which is a further proof to everybody that women are a superior gender. And then all of the other ethical reasons, like, you know, other parents are having small little kids that might never know about me. I don't know, what are the other ethical reasons? It's just families having children. Women are a superior gender. That is what this whole video has really been about, because when I saw that price difference, I was like, you know what, men deserve it. The hidden feminist, out of all of the wrong reasons in life. Well, you know, if men if it weren't for the Karbaats of this world, maybe men would be paid £750 as well. I just say, if like all of these fertility doctors didn't end up being creepy white men in their like 60s and above. So I never thought, shut it, listen, the girl in the back today was present. If you are new here, the girl in the back is what I name my inner voices, because that's totally not the creepiest fucking thing you have heard. Sometimes she tries to win over, you know? I'm like in the middle of the recording, right? And this bitch is talking some shit to me. She's talking bullshit. She's trying to tell me that I can't do this. She literally is like, no, this is not it. Like, stop doing it. In the middle of it. What the fuck? Like, I'm literally in the middle of the fucking thing. She's telling me it's impossible. Okay, is that the end of this script? I am. Imagine if I actually fought. Imagine if you're walking into the room, right? And I'm physically fighting like an imaginary girl in the back. You think I'm insane, right? Well, that's how this works. That's how thoughts work. Because I'm doing it in my head. You just don't physically see it. Yeah, I have just defined overthinking. I have just told you how silly you being an overthinker is. Okay, what is the last sentence in this script? Oh, the last sentence is that I would like to think that I can stop with 1 or 2 donations, or at least keep it at a legal limit. Yeah, that convinced everybody. yeah, I would definitely keep it at a legal limit or a lot lower than that, because I don't want this, whatever the story of the day was, whether it was God complex, whether it was them proving that they're the best out of all of the clinicians, that they're the pioneer in the industry. No, I don't want like 20 mini versions of myself walking around somewhere and then not knowing about me and then finding out about me and me not turning up to be the person that they envision that I will be, because I'm not. Because I have a lot of negative traits. Because I'm a Scorpio, it's you know, it overpowers me, it's not in my control. I will be seeing you next week. This is not a satisfactory ending. Just saying, this is not a satisfactory story. It doesn't have a good ending, and then your own personal story doesn't have the good ending either. Well, here we are. I will let you know if my application gets approved and if my eggs start being donated or something. I don't know. Will I let you know? Will I delete all of this last part? We'll never know, and we will find out in a couple of hours, because I'm about to edit this right now. Shut the fuck. Get out. Get out. Bye, guys. Bye, you squeaky little shit. Why are you walking when I'm recording?